Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our program today from the New Middle East, fault lines to atmospheric jihadism. We're very pleased to have joining us from Paris, from Sciences Po, Professor Gilles Kepel, and from Los Angeles, Antonella Caruso, who is a Pacific Council member and one of my friends and colleagues. This is the third program in our 2021 Global Speaker Series, which is presented jointly by World Affairs, and I always need to add World Affairs of San Francisco for those of us who are not in San Francisco, and the Pacific Council on International Policy in Los Angeles. I'm Jerry Green, the president of the Pacific Council, and I must say, as a Middle East specialist, just sitting in on this session, I feel like I'm at the Middle Eastern equivalent of the Super Bowl, given the talent we have on the program today. I want to introduce our guests. Let me begin with Professor Gilles Kepel, who is, in my world, an iconic figure. And I know you're supposed to say that when you introduce people, but in this case, it's absolutely true. Professor Cappell is a professor at the Paris Sciences et Lettres University. He chairs the Middle East and Mediterranean Excellence Program at the Ecole Normale Supérieure de Paris. He also teaches at CIPO in Paris, and he is a professore aggregato at the University of Italian Switzerland, which, if you're going to be in Switzerland, that's the place to be. His most recent essay is called The Prophet and the Pandemic, From the Middle East to Atmospheric Jihadism, and it was just released in French. It's topped the bestseller lists in France, and it's currently being translated into English and a half dozen other languages. And there's an excerpt, The Murder of Samuel Paty, which is being released in the spring issue of Liberty's Journal. I just want to interject a little bit that most people are experts on the Middle East. People that are experts on Islam are generally experts on Islamic countries. Although we don't generally think of France as being part of the Ummah, part of the Islamic world. Islam in France is a significant cultural, political force. And Professor Cappell is expert not only in countries we traditionally associate with Islam, but also the role of Islam in France and indeed in Europe. And Professor Cappell truly is the leading European expert on Islam, both as a domestic and regional issue in France and in Europe, as well as in the traditional Middle East. So I'm really delighted to welcome him. And as you'll note over his shoulder, you will see he has written more books than many in certain governments have read. And truly, in my world, is a revered figure. Equally revered is my colleague Antonella Caruso. Ms. Caruso is the founder of LAMEDINA, the Institute for International Dialogue in Los Angeles. She's the former director of the Middle East and West Asia Division in the Department of Political Affairs at the United Nations in New York, and she occupied this uniquely important position from 2012 to 2017. Before joining the UN, she developed and organized a Track 2 dialogue on national reconciliation in Iraq that led to the first caucus on the issue in the Iraqi parliament. And she's worked in a variety of private and public sector issues in Europe. Those of us in the Middle East field in Los Angeles celebrate the day that Antonella moved here. It's a holiday on our calendar because we have a small community of those of us who are interested in the Middle East. And by moving to Los Angeles, Antonella made a lot of us really happy and enriched our lives immeasurably. I will be back after the program. I want to turn it over to Antonella. I want to welcome her and Gilles Kepel, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, for your very gracious words. And I'm very pleased to share this conversation on the new Middle East fault lines and the threat of on the jihadi terror threat in France with both a new friend, Jerry, and an old one, Gilles Kepel. So I'm really very pleased to be here and moderate what I'm sure is going to be an incredibly interesting conversation. But let me start this conversation, Gilles, with Afghanistan, the country where the modern call for a global jihad against crusaders and Jews was launched nearly 20 years ago by the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. In Afghanistan, though, the Islamist resistance against foreign invaders, the Soviet Union back then, had already attracted fighters from the Arab and Muslim world in the 1980s. These foreign fighters joined the Afghan Mujahideen, or the Northern Alliance, who, supported by America, Pakistan, and the Arab conservative monarchies of the Persian Gulf, fought against the Soviet army and finally compelled it to withdraw from their country in 1989, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Soviet withdrawal prepared the ground for a bloody and murky civil war that finally brought the obscurantist and zealot Taliban to power, who let Al-Qaeda prosper in their midst and launch its terrorist attack against the United States, thus prompting another foreign invasion and another civil war. In few months, and precisely on September 11, a date that will be forever linked to the Al-Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center in New York, it will be the turn of the American and the NATO forces to leave Afghanistan after their nearly 20-year-old presence on its soil and their failed attempts to win militarily over the Taliban and to promote a political settlement between the latter and the democratically elected government in Kabul. In your views, Gilles, what will the American and NATO troops leave behind in Afghanistan? How will the Taliban make use of their victory over the American superpower? And will this be seen by radical Islamists everywhere as a great victory? The floor is yours, Gilles.
Thank you very much, Antonella. Thank you, Jerry, for your very kind words. We'll have to live up to this introduction. It's not going to be easy. Antonella, you were not mincing your words. Definitely, you're right into the bulk, into the mouth of the monster, if I may say so. Definitely, the challenge that President Biden is facing as part and parcel of his new Middle East deal is enormous, because to start with the end of your question, definitely for jihadists and Islamists worldwide, the departure of America from Afghanistan would be perceived, or they would love to see it, just like the pullout of the Americans from Saigon in 1975, when you had this soldier who rolled the U.S. flag under his shoulder and then jumped on the helicopter. This, I believe, is to be perceived in the general reshuffling of U.S. policy that President Biden is trying to set in motion. And if President Biden manages to bring the Iranians back in the picture, if the outcome of the Iranian election is not totally unfavorable to U.S. and Western interests in June, therefore, if the whole, if you wish, Middle Eastern scene is undergoing a major change after what we saw with the signing of the Abraham agreements, or the so-called Abraham agreements in 2020, then not much actually will be left to the Taliban as a victory. But if America is facing a number of challenges everywhere, if it has problems with its allies, then if no one is able to check the Taliban, then it's going to be the sort of their revenge is going to be in full bloom. And also, what is very striking is that people who worked with the U.S. over the last 2 decades will feel that they are being totally abandoned. And the level of violence in Afghanistan is already huge. People are being shot by the Taliban. There are traitors, so-called traitors, collaborators, and whatever. And this is not, of course, giving a very good sign to people who have sealed their fate with the U.S. and the region, whether it be in Iraq, whether it be the Kurds and others. So this is definitely, I believe, President Biden is walking a tightrope with this issue. The way I see it, he is trying to deal with the big picture in order to minimize the inconvenience in Afghanistan. But that means that he can, if I may say so, set the whole Middle East issue, including Afghanistan, I mean, the wider Middle East issue, right, which is no cakewalk, if I may say so.
Thank you, Gilles. But it seems that the Taliban have not actually yet severed their links with Al-Qaeda. And if things go well or bad, we will be seeing it. Definitely, there is a uncertain future ahead of us. But the countries around, surrounding, Afghanistan seem not to be willing to let, Kabul collapse. So do you think there will be an enhanced role, of Pakistan in making sure in the end that the Taliban behave? Or what will be the role of India and Russia and Iran and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and China, or also Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, all really involved in making sure that the Afghanistan doesn't fall again into a very bloody civil war?
Well, this is a sort of optimistic way of seeing international relations, no doubt, after your stay at the UN. And why not? Actually, this is. I would not say it is wishful thinking, but this is definitely what we wish. But better than I do, dear Antonella, that the vested interests of Russia are not exactly the ones of America. And whatever happens in Afghanistan that harms America will be music to the ears of Vladimir Putin, particularly if we remember that he was already in the KGB when Afghanistan was invaded in 1979, and also when the Soviet Union left in 1989. And if I may go back to what you mentioned earlier on, because I think it will give us some insights on the Afghan issue. The Soviet or the Red Army pullout from Afghanistan took place on February 15, 1989. You were very young at the time. I was already 34. See how old I am. So I was able to read and write. And even someone like me who was supposedly well versed, and I should not say that to Jerry because he will not make this nice presentation anymore in the future that he made. Even I did not really notice the Soviet pullout on the 15th of February because we were all obsessed with what had happened the day before. That is Ayatollah Khomeini's Valentine's Day fatwa against Salman Rushdie, which was designed precisely to pull the carpet under the feet of the American and Saudi-sponsored jihad. And actually, even though the Soviet Union fell and the Berlin Wall fell on 11/9, maybe, which was a sort of a premonition of what would be 9/11 afterwards, 1989, the Afghan issue was not only something Afghan, but it was also something that that functioned worldwide. The Iranians would not let the Saudis and the Americans consider that this was their victory. And Khomeini used that and used poor Rushdie as a pretext in order to look like he was the leader, the real leader of the angry, the entrepreneur of rage, of wrath of the Muslim world. Something, to some extent, that, we, which is strangely consonant with what we are seeing now. Except that we have Mr. Erdogan, who's wearing the mantle of Khomeini as the new entrepreneur of rage of the Muslim world, and who's doing that also in order to challenge Saudi leadership. This year, because of COVID-19, Saudi Arabia, who was a good pupil of the World Health Organization, did not have Hajj by the end of July. Hence, because of you would not like Mecca to become a supercluster, of course, and hence you had no images of 2.5 million Muslims gathered to the strength of Islam, which is the image that you have on the Hajj every year, and who benefited from that, who played Khomeini in a way of sorts. Mr. Erdogan, who re-Islamized Hagia Sophia, Saint Sophie in Istanbul, and tried to portray himself as the leader of Muslims oppressed in the world, as the super defender of Muslims against Islamophobes, against Macron, against what have you. So this is something to just make a parallel, a historical parallel, but which brings us to the present with issues Afghan. That they are not only, as you mentioned earlier on, something that has to do with Afghanistan per se. It has to do with its neighbors, but the neighbors are not only thinking in terms of collapse or not collapse, which of course might be detrimental to their own interests, and the Talibanization of Pakistan, for instance, was a key issue at the time, but also to what extent for either rivals of the United States like Russia or Iran, for the time being, unless Iran becomes a friend of the United States within 3 months, but I'm not entirely sure of that, even though I'm as optimistic as you, as a matter of leading my life. Those adversaries or those enemies of the U.S. would not dislike to see it stumble. Not to mention some of the allies that believe that they have been treated harshly by President Biden, including the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince or the Turkish president, and or the would-be Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, if he becomes a prime minister, actually. So, and this can be a matter of bargaining with President Biden, bargaining for supporting him, or on the contrary, abstaining. And this is a major challenge. I mean, this is the big challenge of President Biden's new Middle East policy.
Fully agree with you. So it deserves really all our attention and focus, on following up what happens, within and without Afghanistan. But the Taliban's victory, Gina, will reverberate, if not already reverberates, across the wider Middle East, where there are self-proclaimed Islamist resistance movements who fight against, the presence of foreign occupations of the land. And I'm referring in particular to Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, but also, reverberates, among terrorist groups, and for instance, Al-Nusra in Syria that remains linked to Al-Qaeda. How do you see really this Taliban portrayed victory over the American superpower, impact on the strength and the commitment of these movements to continue their armed struggles?
Well, as of today, we do not know whether the Taliban will win or not. I mean, there are a number of parameters and variables that still are unclear, and which as we just mentioned, depend enormously of what will become of President Biden's U.S. policy in the weeks and the months to come. B, I am not convinced that the Taliban have that much of an international outreach. They are, and this is what made them actually so successful, a very Islamist cum nationalist movement. And when you had the pre-Taliban jihadi movement in Afghanistan, you know, they were linked with the Gulf countries that subsidized them. They had, you know, some of them were part of the Muslim Brothers, others were this and that. The Taliban are really indigenous, they're really native. Not to say that their example may not instill in some others a sort of desire to imitate them, but I'm not sure that they have direct influence on what remains of Al-Qaeda. Sort of, we don't know what became of Ayman al-Zawahiri, and anyone who cares, should I say now. In terms of Jabhat al-Nusra, they are not in a very good position. They are now in their in the so-called deconfliction zone of Idlib, torn between the Turkish anvil and the Syrian and Russian hammer. The Turks have now told them that they should look nice on TV, and their leader has shaved its beard to look like a hipster. He's having a much more sort of US West Coast compatible dress than the one I have, a jacket and shirt that I have tonight. And so I am not convinced that they will look great on that. As of Hezbollah, even though recently, and this is something which I developed in this last book of mine, which in French is called The Prophet and the Pandemic, that there was what I call a sort of Muslim brother Shia axis, including Turkey, Qatar, and Iran on the one hand, facing the Abraham Agreement group, if you wish. Nevertheless, the Taliban are still perceived in Shia circles as the worst enemies of Shias ever. And the massacre of Afghan Shias, the Hazara, by the Taliban in Afghanistan is still something very deep in their memory. And, you know, among the Iranian proxies that fought in Syria with Bashar al-Assad and against the Sunni rebellion and then the Sunni jihadist groups, there was a significant contingent of Afghan Shias, the Hazaras, who were part of the fiercest fighters because they had those memories of their families and friends being slaughtered en masse by the Hazaras in Mazar al-Sharif way back.
Thank you, Gilles. I would love to really go back, to your division of the Middle East into these two main axes. You know, you call one brotherist Shiite. It's a little bit difficult for me to accept, this religious denomination to an axis that, includes Iran, yes, but it doesn't represent all Shia in the Arab world, in the Arab and Islamic world. So the two axes, the pro-political Islam, so pro-Islamist axis, Turkey, Qatar, and Iran, that face the other anti-Islamist axis, I would say Egypt, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. But even in Israel now, there is an Islamist party, RAM, that might hold a key, for the next probably Netanyahu government. So can you explain better your division, of the Middle East into these two axes, please?
Absolutely. The king of Israel is Mansour Abbas now. He's the one who can shots. He's a Muslim brother guy. And he has, with his 4 members of Knesset, he's the one who can decide whether Netanyahu or Bennett can be the future prime minister, which is fascinating. It is as fascinating as the fact that, Qatar every month sends a plane full of 30 million US dollar banknotes in, I don't know whether it's in $1 notes or $50 notes, because there is no banking system functioning in Gaza, to Tel Aviv airport. Then the cash is conveyed to Eretz, to the border points. Then the Egyptian intelligence takes over, brings it to Gaza, the capital. And then Hamas redistributes to the needy and also takes some overheads for itself. And this fascinating thing that Hamas is being subsidized thanks to Israeli facilitation, whereas Hamas supposedly is the nemesis of Israel. Qatari ambassador for the reconstruction of Gaza, Mohammed al-Hamadi, was received and thanked by the current president of the state of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, is something which, of course, raises eyebrows. What the hell is happening there? And but this is not at all, I believe, weakening my understanding of what happened in 2020. I mean, this book was, which I wrote in a way after another one that was published in America, but at the time of COVID, and by a university press, Columbia, that did not do much to promote it, and which still is called Away from Chaos, which dealt with the last 50 years from 1973 to the present. So I was amazed that so many things were happening in 2020 because of the pandemic, because of the fact that, oil kingdoms who, they all said, okay, we know about global warming, we're going to do something. But in the meanwhile, oil money was coming, so they didn't do much. And suddenly they saw the price of the barrel crumble and reach minus 35 something dollars in April. And so that sent a shockwave to them, and they said, "Okay, let's use the money we have now, the royalties, the sovereign funds, and something to prepare for the future energy transition to renewables. Let's invest in it. Let's be leaders." And this, in my view, is what led the Emirates first and foremost, then Bahrain, which is it's just Saudi Arabia did not want to enter the fold directly, so they sent Bahrain, which is largely an ally of Saudi Arabia, to say the least, and then Sudan and Morocco to join the fold, because they thought that the antagonism with Israel was not significant anymore, and that they should use their money to buy Israeli high-tech to fund the startup nation, to take some control and influence over it. And we saw it with Qatar, which is not part of the Abraham Alliance, but which through Hamas is influential in Israel, and probably through Mansour Abbas and the Ra'am party, which is linked to the Muslim Brothers worldwide, is also influential, which is the fascinating thing. Now, this alliance of political Islam, whether it be Sunni or Shi'i, is, I believe, something that changed the game of late in the region. When I was touring the Middle East during the so-called Arab Springs, I remember stopping over in Qatar in 2012, where I interviewed Sheikh Youssef al-Qaradawi, an Egyptian ulama who's not the televangelist, the telecoranist, if you'd rather, of Al Jazeera channel. He's the most prominent advocate of the Muslim Brothers worldwide, and he was advocating all Muslim rebellions except for Bahrain. He said to me, "No, this is not an Arab Spring at all. This is Iranian manipulation. This is the Shias who support Bashar al-Assad and whatever." He was adamant against them at the time. Now those things have changed. And I remember Minister Javad Zarif, whom I had known way back when I was at the time I was attending the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he was always in the panels that I was organizing. And he stopped over in Paris a couple of years ago or 3 years ago. So we had lunch, and he said to me, you know, Gilles, we think that the Muslim Brothers are part and parcel of the political sphere in the Arab world, and that they should not be persecuted. This also, as we say in French, an arrow in the garden of Marshal Sisi. But actually, you know, Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, translated in Farsi, in Persian, 2 books by Sayyid Qutb, the radical advocate of the Muslim Brothers. And actually, the Khomeini people, you know, they sort of built their understanding of political Islam, even in Shia terms, largely through their reading of the works of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Brothers in Egypt, and Sayyid Qutb. So this, you know, when we had the war in Syria with Iran backing Bashar al-Assad and the Gulf Petromonarchies backing the rebels against Iran, you know, then at the time you had this big Shia-Sunni fault line, just like Protestants and Catholics in Europe in the 15th century versus Catholics. Nowadays, things have changed. They have changed also due to Russian influence, because when the Russians sponsored the Astana Agreement between them, or under the auspices, Turkey and Iran, so you had people who had backed, some of them, Russia and Iran had backed Bashar al-Assad, Turkey had backed the rebels, and suddenly they decided there was something more important, which was keeping the West out of the region and the conflict, right? So in 2020, I believe this sort of what I call the triplice in Italian, the triple
alleanza. Yeah. Sounds strange, but
yeah. Well, you know, when I used terms that came from the treaties by the end of World War I, because actually, you know, the Middle East has been molded by that. You know, it's the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. And also, you know, when Ataturk decided to re-Islamize Hagia Sophia, when did he do it? On the 24th of July. What is the 24th of July? It's the anniversary of the Lausanne Treaty, i.e. it's Ataturk, the military man, who fought and pushed away from Anatolia, the Turks, the Greeks, the Armenians, the French, the Italians, and what have you. And this is Ataturk, the military man who founded modern Turkey. And Erdogan stood in his shoes, in a way, in order to twist the arm of the other Ataturk, the secularist Ataturk, who had desecrated the mosque in Saint Sophia to turn it into a museum as a gift to mankind. You know, so this issue of the post the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the frontiers, and everything is still in everyone's mind. Yeah, remember when we had the caliphate, the so-called ISIS or Daesh, as we say in French and in Arabic, caliphate. They brought this guy from, he was a Palestinian from Chile, I think, with a bulldozer, who bulldozed the border between Iraq and Syria, because the caliphate was a cavallo on both. And,
right.
And they, sorry, I had a Zoom in Italian before, so I mixed up things.
Sorry.
And this was very important because it was a means to show to Arabs worldwide, not necessarily jihadists, that hey, we, the Islamic caliphates, are the ones who can settle the scores with the infamous Sykes-Picot agreements, whereas the nationalist leaders, Arab leaders, just kept the borders for their own benefit. We are the only ones with a worldview, with an Islamic worldview and the like. Yeah? So this is why I believe that this opposition between the Turkish, Qatari and Iranian bloc on the one hand, and the Abraham Alliance took shape in the 2020s. Sorry. Now things have changed and have moved. First and foremost, the blockade against Qatar stopped because Donald Trump was on his way out, and the Qatari emir went to Al-Ula and kissed Mohammed bin Salman, and vice versa, of course, with social distancing due to COVID and COVID-19. And so this is changing. You had talks very recently between a Saudi delegation and an Iranian delegation under the auspices of Mustafa al-Kazemi in Iraq. And also the Iranian axis has weakened significantly. You know, in 2018, after when the war was over, largely in Syria, Iran looked like he emerged as the winner. There was this so-called Shiite crescent, to quote King Abdullah of Jordan, from the Gulf or the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, a sort of remake of the Sassanid Empire of old. They controlled largely Iraq through proxies, they controlled Syria, and they largely controlled Lebanon. Now it's more complicated. Mustafa al-Kazemi is not a puppet of Ali Khamenei in Iran. In Syria, it is not easy for the Iranians because not only the Turks are around, but also the interests of Vladimir Putin and that of Ali Khamenei are not the same. Right. Iran wants to use Syria as a missile launching pad against Israel. The Russians want to make Syria viable because they don't want to see Syria as a new Afghanistan. You know, remember, and Putin remembers that very well. He was in the KGB and still is probably at the time. You know, they came to Afghanistan in Christmas 1970.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have just 20 minutes left, and the questions arrive on Islam in France. So I think, maybe we should also satisfy the request of the many who are following us. And let's move to France, the place of origin of the highest number of European foreign terrorist fighters in the Syrian civil war, but also the country that has been recently and increasingly exposed to the jihadi attacks. Since 2015, over 300 victims, and many places, obviously, again, touched by the jihadi violence. You have been analyzing the evolution of Islam and Islamist movements in Europe since the 80s. Your 1987 book, Le Banlieue de l'Islam, so the neighborhoods of Islam, was the first deep analysis of how Islam was taking shape in these impoverished, marginalized neighborhoods at the periphery of cities in France. Obviously, you have had many more books and articles published on the subject since then. But Islam, as you confirmed in your 87 book, was not an Islam de combat, so not an Islam of conflict and war, but mainly an Islam of piety. What happened, from moving, from this Islam of piety to what, you also describe as takeover of Islamists, radical Islamists, jihadi groups over this neighborhood? So what are the main causes of the radicalization of a minority of French youth of Muslim faith?
Well, as you just said, it is not a phenomenon which is widespread among Muslims, our Muslim compatriots in France or yours in Italy or others in Belgium. It's a very strong minority phenomenon, but this minority phenomenon is a major problem. Only this last weekend we had a guy from Tunisian descent who stabbed to death a clerk in a police precinct in the outskirts of Paris, in Rambouillet. And we had access to his Facebook page was available, and I looked through it. It covered the last 10 years. The guy was not particularly a jihadi. He believed in political Islam. He was a Tunisian. He backed the Hannouchi and the Karama party in Tunisia. He loved all what we call the Islamo-leftists in France, the Committee Against Islamophobia and everything. He sort of retweeted everything all the time. But he was not really an advocate for jihad, for violence, for the killing of infidels or apostates. And then suddenly this Ramadan, after he had posted things of increased piety, he disappeared and then came with a knife, stabbed. And while he had his earphones plugged into his ears, and he had religious Islamic anashid while he was singing, while he was stabbing the poor lady. Now, one thing, and which makes the link with the first part of our conversation, is that we had those jihadist movements worldwide that changed the face of jihadism. There were already some Europeans going to Afghanistan, which you mentioned earlier on, and you talked a lot about Afghanistan, not me. So you don't put the blame on the poor French. The Italian was responsible, and there were a few people who went there. Al Qaeda, strangely enough, because the French were perceived, French intelligence agencies were perceived as efficient, particularly after the jihad in Algeria stepped into France in the late 1990s and was repressed. Al-Qaeda didn't send anyone to France, really. The attacks took place in America, in Britain, in Spain, in Africa, wherever. We didn't have much. But then, after Al-Qaeda, we had this third generation of jihadists, ISIS. One of the main ideologues was a Syrian who had studied in France. Abu Musab al-Suri had studied engineering, and who considered that nowadays it was, America, the faraway enemy, was okay, but it was too far away, actually. And it was better to target Europe and to target the country where the Muslims were the most numerous and where Muslims from Arab descent were the most numerous, which is France. Because if you talk about Britain, it's mostly subcontinental Islam. About Turkey, it's mostly Turkish Islam. And even though there are jihadist movements which have reached out to those communities, nevertheless, this culture of jihad of the 1990s and early 2000s is mainly an Arab rather than a Turkish or a subcontinental ideology, right? And it was so it could penetrate better into those milieux. Why France? France is at the forefront of secularism, and as we have it in French, it's called laïcité, and something which make a space for everyone of any creed under the aegis of the law, but which is perceived by militant Islamists as enmity to Islam, because the fact that you consider that religion doesn't have a say in state affairs is perceived as kufr, as disbelief, or as infidelity, or whatever. And this is one of the reasons why Erdogan was so adamant against France, because Erdogan wants to pull out secularism from Turkey. Secularism in Turkey was created by Atatürk with a French model. If you go to Ankara to his mausoleum, you will see his copy of the social contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in French with Atatürk's annotation in French. This is anathema to Erdogan. And fighting against Macron, accusing the French of Islamophobia, demonizing French secularism was a means to settle his own accounts with Atatürk and to erase his intellectual legacy to a large extent. So the reason why we had many more fighters, ISIS fighters in France was linked, I believe, to a large extent to the fact that the majority of the Muslim population in France is Arab, to this focalization of political Islam against French secularism, and also issues of social deprivation are important, but they are not necessarily more important in France than they may be in Britain or in Belgium or in Germany or in Italy. And but I think the special blend of all those things was what made ISIS, if I may say so popular. Plus, this issue of so-called blasphemy in France, the Charlie Hebdo cartoons sort of provided a great pretext or a motive, whatever you want, to galvanize or to mobilize a wider constituency apart from the true blue or true green, if you in this case jihadists. Like, for instance, the guy who stabbed to death this poor lady on Friday. This fall, when there was this issue of the Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons, he posted on his Facebook page a sort of I don't know the terms in English. His image under the aegis of something in Arabic that says "Illa Rasulallah," everything but the envoy of Allah, the Prophet Muhammad. Hence, this is sacred. Don't hands off, if you wish. And therefore, he was making a clear break with the sort of infidel society. He didn't say at the time that he was, going into action and going to crime or murder or jihad or what have you. But this is what happened. And what I try to show in this new book and in the excerpt that Liberty's journal has published this week, in English, under the title "The Murder of Samuel Paty," is to try to show that now, in my view, there is what I call a fourth generation of jihadism. Phase one was Afghanistan, that you described earlier on, backed by the CIA, funded by the petromonarchies, ousting the USSR, but unsuccessful in Egypt, in Algeria, and what have you. Right. Then Al-Qaeda learns the lessons. Faraway enemy targets America, 9/11. Doesn't succeed in Iraq, doesn't manage significantly to make a breakthrough, except in the minds, in Muslim minds. Then phase three, ISIS, a sort of negation of negation in the sort of Hegelian process of the dialectics of jihad, the Aufhebung, if I may say so. And then what we have is this Suri guy say, hey, Europe is the soft underbelly of the West. America is too far away, and we have to use all those angry young Muslims, or a few of them actually, but a few thousands was enough, to send them, train in North Africa or whatever, come back to their country of origin, plant bombs, stab people, go to the Levant. And then we had the Arab Spring. We had the revolt in Iraq with the Sunnis rebelling against the American invasion, the radicalization of Iraqi Sunnis, and the blend of the two Abu Musabs, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi from Jordan and acting in Iraq, and Abu Musab al-Suri from Syria and Europe. And this is what led to this third generation. Then it was destroyed. ISIS was destroyed. This network-based bottom-up jihad was destroyed by the use of software, by whatever Palantir or what have you, the bombings of the caliphate. They have become inefficient as a system, as an organization. And then we have this fourth generation now, which I call atmospheric jihadism, where on the one hand, you have entrepreneurs of wrath or of rage, who target people, who single out people, stereotype them and say they are enemies of Allah, they are bad Muslims, they are whatever. And those guys don't ask for people to be killed. They don't. They just throw a bad light on them, if I may say so. And then you have others who, based on this invasion of the web and social networks by those targetings, then decide to get to action. And there is no institutional or organizational link between the two. This is the big challenge now. Like when we have the police has not found anything on this guy who stabbed the poor lady on Friday within the organization, and the same was true with the Pakistani who tried to kill two people in September in France in front of what he thought was the Charlie Hebdo building, with Abdullah Anzorov, the Chechen who beheaded teacher Samuel Paty, or with the Tunisian refugee who just crossed over from Vintimiglia into Menton and illegally and killed 3 people in Nice in the Basilica of Notre Dame on the day of the anniversary of the birth of the Prophet. So this is a new phenomenon. This is what I call atmospheric jihadism, because it spreads through the atmosphere, not through a network. To some extent, I mean, the metaphor could be a viral metaphor. This is also the pandemic in the title, and
right.
This is one of the challenges that we're facing now. It is very complicated, but as opposed to what we had in the past, where we were way back after the emergence of a new type of jihadism. It took us 5, 6, 7 years to understand what was happening. What I believe is that now we're trying to understand what is happening on the spot, and this may make the difference.
Yeah. Last question before I really give the floor to one question left, from our friends following us, is really, let's go back a little bit, to the French secularism, which is it's in its own, a subject of a great conversation to develop, hopefully very, very, very soon. But obviously, the French laïcité means a freedom of religion, but as you also stressed, several times, freedom from religion. But it also implies the neutrality of state in religious matter. But it seems that French governments had been in a way intervening in helping shape the Islam in France. Macron calls for a revival of enlightened Islam, and even help selecting its representatives. So the state expands its control, it expands into the domain of religion and increasingly controls expression of the Muslim faith, with the aim, obviously, of protecting the laws of the Republic, social cohesion, and religious peace. But this expansion of the state in the domain of religion risks, though, putting French Muslims against French Muslims, meaning the separatist minority and the silent majority, but also French against the French, the ones who feel victims of Islamophobia and the ones who fear and feel threatened by them. Thus, in a way, falling into the trap of what you were saying, the jihadi propaganda, meaning creating this kind of isolated society with its own rules against the rest of the impious and infidel, French/Muslim society as a whole.
Well, thank you for the way you formulated this question. We're so used with the woke culture coming from the West Coast that it's refreshing to hear another view. I don't think that the state is meddling by itself in the affairs of Islam. The problem is that in order to deal with any religion, because there's freedom of expression of religions, or you can have your religion. France is within the frame of public order, and in order to do so, you have to have representatives of this and that faith, not because the state wants to influence this understanding of Catholicism or of Protestantism or of Judaism, but because you have to have representatives of each who can say, okay, we organize the not cult, I say in English, the worship under our auspices. This will follow the rules of public order and so on. Now, the problem with many Muslims is that they were poor, as you mentioned. They were disinherited. They were marginalized. They have not been able to become institutionalized, and the state, as laïque as it is or as secular as it is, needs institutionalized partners in order to grant freedom of worship. And this is the only issue at stake. Well, the French state within the CFCM or Council of the Muslim religion in France. Within it, you have Muslim Brothers, you have Tabligh people, you have a number of people who are not really who are not of the liking of the French authorities or main political parties at all. I mean, they have not selected only what they called in the colonial days béni oui oui, of people who were subservient to the rulers. Not at all. The problem is to bring them together so that they will deliver in terms of public order. Then it is not in the realm of the state to tell you what is enlightened or obscurantist Islam. This is an issue for the public debate, but this is not an issue for state authorities. And they're very careful not to trample.
Not to step in. Thank you, Gilles. We have few questions, actually. So one, bonsoir, Professor Keppel. Men in the US military are running from counterinsurgency as a doctrine, ironically, despite its effectiveness in recent years. What are your thoughts on counterinsurgency as one of several approaches to addressing and reducing terrorism, regionally or globally? Gilles, we have basically 3 minutes left. I hope, we can have a little extension of our talk.
Yes. What kind of counterinsurgency? You mean in the Middle East, for instance? Or?
The question doesn't specify. So I believe, it's mainly in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, counterinsurgency was finally quite efficient against ISIS.
Yeah.
Why? Because on the one hand, as I mentioned, the codes were broken of ISIS. ISIS was not understood by intelligence networks because they still had the Al Qaeda software. It took them a lot of time, and then the thief was much ahead of the gendarme or the carabinieri or the cop, if I may say so. Then against the caliphate. The caliphate had a territory, but when you have a territory, you're vulnerable to air force and to bombings. And this was, Al Qaeda had no territory to some extent, and this was the weakness of ISIS that originally started as a network-based thing. And the minute they started to have a territory, then they were to some extent doomed.
Yes.
Now, these are the lessons learned from the 4th generation of jihadism. They have no territory and they have no organization, and they have influence. They have entrepreneurs of wrath who may reach out in far wider, much wider than the traditional jihadi groups did. And then you have individuals who are not lone wolves at all, who have been brainwashed, who have adhered to those principles through encounters, through human networks, through the internet, and then one day decide to take action and stab here and there. And this is the big challenge now. This is something which, unfortunately, in France we've been the vanguard of, And we definitely welcome a much wider debate and contradiction with what some of us have found.
Gilles, on this point, I will end my list of questions for you because Judith Miller really refers to this atmospheric jihadism, the fourth generation, may be less dangerous to society than the earlier versions, meaning it probably doesn't pose the same threat the Al-Qaeda did with 9/11 or ISIS with its territorial caliphate, the size of Britain, or does it? So is this atmospheric jihad less dangerous than the previous incarnation of jihadis?
Well, in terms of, if you consider that the criterion is the number of people killed, there were few people killed from September to yesterday. As compared to, the mass slaughters of ISIS, particularly in November 2015. And we're going to have a mega super trial in France, which is going to run all around the presidential campaign next year on that. But if you think that this is going to help the breakaway of European societies, because people, you see, saw the reactions of the extreme right after the stabbing in Rambouillet, who said, why do you talk of any difference between Islamists, jihadists, and Muslims? All those guys are Muslim. The Facebook profile of the killer said he was not at all a jihadist. He was a sort of mild political Islamist. So they're all alike. They're all immigrants. The ones who, all the criminals were migrants, the last four. And therefore, we have to radicalize against them. So the political consequences may be more serious. But, at the time being, it's not the issue of, it's important. If Judy says it is important to think of whether or not it is more or less dangerous. But I guess that at the time, what is, I believe, significant is that we try to analyze the phenomenon, to think it to think it right, not to lose all those years we lost in the past, like when we had our French anti-terrorism czar in 2012 saying that the Mohammed Merah attacks in Toulouse was a lone wolf. The guy was not at all a lone wolf. He was imbued with this coming ISIS ideology.
Thank you, Gina. I think, from my side, I have bad words of praise, for this lovely conversation as usual, and hoping really to continue. Yes, to continue it in the very near future, et peut-être à Paris. À très bientôt, Gilles, et merci beaucoup.
Grazie mille, à bientôt.
À bientôt.
I want to thank both of our speakers for a fascinating conversation and a very informative one, and I hope we can do it again. It certainly was really enlightening. I want to thank our colleagues at the World Affairs Council in San Francisco, Philip Yun and Carla Thorson, and the entire staff. They are extraordinarily good partners, and if you put San Francisco and Los Angeles together, we are representing the fifth largest economy in the world and a state in its own right, being California. But like many good things, we turn to Europe for wisdom and expertise. So I thank you both. I just want to end by announcing on May 13th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, we're planning on a conversation on the future of Afghanistan with former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Federica Mogherini, who is the former High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. With this, I want to end our session. Gilles, thank you so much. Antonella, thank you yet again, and I want to thank our audience for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, Gilles.